White supremacy is in all of these systems, policies, and practices that we have to systematically dismantle one at a time. That's our task. Sit down! One day soon, we will see these Confederate monuments torn down.
Hello, this is Black Kids in Outer Space. I'm the host, Lark Lowe, and I'm so excited that today I have Lawrence Brown, actually Dr. Lawrence Brown. I know he's not into that, but I'm gonna use that. You earned it. You gotta embrace that. Lawrence T. Brown is the grandson of Mississippi Delta sharecroppers and preachers. He is a native of West Memphis, Arkansas, and moved to Baltimore in the fall of 2010. His current research addresses the impact of historical trauma on community health. He is currently working on a book tentatively entitled The Black Butterfly, Why We Must Make Black Neighborhoods Matter, to be published in late 2018 or 2019. He is a racial equity consultant and organizer with the radical collective Baltimore Bloc, a co-founder of the Lead Poisoning Awareness Initiative, Be More Lead Free, and an associate professor at Morgan State University in the School of Community Health and Policy. Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you for being on the Black Kids and Out of Space show.
Look, I've made it. I've made it to Black Kids and Out of Space. I'm excited. Thank you for having me.
No problem. You know what? I'm excited to have you because you are, you are on the ship. You're one of our captains in outer space. So, hey. The first thing I want to ask is your book that you're writing about is about the black butterfly. Can you go a little bit into that and what's the black butterfly?
Sure. When you look at Baltimore in terms of, especially using the racial dot map by Dustin Cable at the University of Virginia, you can see very quickly he uses 4 different colors: light green, red, orange, and light blue to denote where different racial groups live in the city, or one dot actually represents one person. And so you see a very powerful, very strong pattern. In the middle of our city, running east from downtown, you see the white L where the white population lives. And then spread out in East and West Baltimore, there's this pattern of, when I drew it in 2015, listening to Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, and I said, okay, this, it's just looking at it, it looks like a butterfly, so I'm going to call it the black butterfly. And the black butterfly is really just a allegorical, metaphorical name that really describes how the black population is distributed in a geographical way here in Baltimore. And you see very clearly what Princeton sociologist Douglas Massey talks about when he talks about hyper-segregation. And he basically says, he and his colleagues, they use 5 different measures to look at segregation, racial segregation in terms of residential dispersal. And you see that Baltimore ranks very highly in all 5 categories. And so when that happens, it's basically a category 5 hyper-segregated city. And Baltimore is just that city. It's a category 5 hyper-segregated city, along with 7 other cities: Chicago, Flint, Detroit, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Birmingham, and Cleveland. These are the top 8 when you add in Baltimore, category 5 hyper-segregated cities we've seen in America. And think about what we've seen in these cities: Flint, lead poisoning; Chicago, high violence. Cleveland had a near uprising after the Tamir Rice verdict. You see lots of police brutality, lots of violence, hyper-policing by police in disproportionately redline Black communities. So hyper-segregation breeds a certain kind of intense segronomics, a term that Naliwe Rooks talks about: intense redlining, intense subpriming, intense hyper-policing, structural apartheid in American cities.
Well, I think one thing is really interesting about Baltimore and the cities that you named in regards to hyper-segregation, even places like Milwaukee, me being Angelino, being from Los Angeles, these are places that I kind of like, oh, there are Black people there. Right. It's like, it's weird, but the places that are the most hyper-segregated are also the places where Black people are not seen, not just you're hyper segregated. So you're actually not even within the Black community. Like we often talk about Los Angeles, we often talk about New York, we do talk about Chicago, but places like Milwaukee, places like Baltimore, places like Cleveland, a lot of people don't really recognize those places as even being ground zero for anything.
Right.
So, I mean, this is something that I find really interesting. You said something about redlining. Can you explain redlining in regards to the history, in regards to Baltimore? I mean, I know it's something that's happened to all of us who are part of the diaspora, but in Baltimore, I think it's very interesting, the history between redlining and the rest of the country. Can you go into that a little bit, Mr. Brown, or actually Dr. Brown?
No problem. When you think about hyper segregation in those 8 cities that I named, which I believe I should add in Birmingham, 7 out of 8 of those are not in the Deep South. Cleveland, Detroit, Flint, Chicago, Milwaukee, Baltimore. Where are these cities? These are Midwest, northern cities in the United States. And so what are we dealing with when we talk about racial segregation? We're talking about many of the places where Black people left the Deep South during the Great Migrations. And they arrived in these cities further north, outside of the South, and these cities reacted with a regime of racial segregation. So basically, one of the measures of racial segregation is isolation. And that goes to the sort of invisibilization that you see in a city like Milwaukee. Like, segregation is designed to cordon off a community so you really can't see it. It's marginalized. It's put off into a place where it can be easily neglected. And once that happens, once you have racial segregation, then the racial segregation essentially becomes weaponized into redlining. And so redlining adds the economic component onto racial segregation. I like to tell people, the damage of segregation is not that white people and Black people don't live next to each other. Black people can do just fine without white people. The problem is the economic weaponization that takes place due to racial segregation. That segronomics, that redlining, which is essentially when banks and financial institutions do not provide traditional, affordable financial mechanisms where Black communities can obtain capital. And the question is, what happens to a community when it can't have capital, when it's starved of capital year after year, decade after decade? That's redlining. And the communities essentially end up dying in terms of an economic death, high unemployment, people struggling to make ends meet, so they go into the illegal economy. So redlining is truly devastating. People can't build wealth because they can't get those home loans in order to obtain and become a homeowner and build wealth that way. And that's happened all across America, wherever Black people live in Black neighborhoods and urban areas.
I think that was one thing that really struck me when I looked at an actual map of redlining, and I looked at it and I'm like, wow, these are places where my people came from, people who I knew. These are areas that I knew were Black neighborhoods. And it seemed like it was like specific, like Black people live here, let's redline it. It was disturbing. It hurt me because, my family, we had property in these places. And, you think about the wealth that disappeared, that was taken away from even Black people who were able to obtain property. Your property ends up being worth nothing. So I noticed another thing about Baltimore is in 1910, it had the first racial zoning laws. I mean, that's amazing that redlining started in Baltimore.
I mean, Baltimore is ground zero for American apartheid. I mean, before 1910, yes, you had racial segregation in transportation, rail cars, steamboats, those are racially segregated. You had racial segregation in education. Black and white children did not go to school together. But until then, until 1910, there was no formal law that Black and white people couldn't live in the same communities together. And so Baltimore, again, 1910 is when the Great Migration is really getting underway. Baltimore and Maryland are southern border states. So whereas in the Deep South, there may be an unwritten understanding that Black people would stay in their place, this is a border state. Maryland's a border state. Baltimore, so that you have a lot of people coming from the north, a lot of people coming from the south. And so I believe that's why Baltimore makes it explicit, because it's a border state saying, we have a little bit of this, a little bit of that. No, let's make sure we let people know we are Southern as well. That this is a racist city and we want to maintain white supremacy. And so that impetus, and there was also this public health impetus as well, that you had diseases like tuberculosis, which were endemic and epidemic in many Black communities, precisely because of slum housing conditions. Many Black people lived in alley homes in at a time when the sewer system hadn't been built in certain areas, when certain roads had been paved. And so with the lack of sanitation, you can imagine diseases like tuberculosis being more prevalent in certain areas. And so that Blackness became synonymous with disease. Blackness became synonymous with crime. And so that the fear of a Black neighbor, that animated and pushed Baltimore's white citizens to create that first racial zoning law in America.
Yes. And we can go to current day, where we have in Baltimore $513 million spent on the police and prosecution, and $249 million on health and housing, community, art and cultures and parks. I mean, even today, of course, you're going to be impacted, but do you want to go a little bit about present day Baltimore and what's going on in regards to the? I mean, I was shocked at what I've read about, just kind of doing some research on you and your research.
Yeah, I think and I want to go back to 1937, because that's when the federal government, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, draws Baltimore's redlining map. With the assistance of the Baltimore City Planning Department. So the city and the federal government combine to create the residential security map, which has those four colors: blue, green, yellow, and red. And red is where Baltimore's Black community lived. So the redlining that took place in 1937, it leads to, and it proliferates the sort of redlining that we see today. Now, when you talk about Baltimore's budget, our Mayor Pugh, just allocated over $500 million for police for the first time in city's history. We spend more on policing in our city budget than we do health, housing, arts, parks, and workforce development combined. And so you literally have a situation, we have an apartheid budget where we spend more on policing than we do on these activities and sectors and systems that support life. More on social control than we do on supporting life. And I think that's really what an apartheid city ends up doing. We essentially perpetuate the apartheid that we started in 1910, and now it's reflected and maintained in our budget. And I think it's important to highlight that Baltimore has a Black mayor, majority Black city council, a Black police commissioner. And so you have the perverseness of white supremacy and blackface. You have white supremacy systems that operate in much the same way, even though you have Black political leadership. And that speaks to, I think, this notion, Dr. Jared Ball would call it internal colonization theory, or internal colonization, that in fact many Black neighborhoods are colonized, not simply redlined and also subprimed, but colonized. And so essentially many of our leaders get co-opted into serving the auspices of white capital, as opposed to serving the needs of disinvested redline Black communities.
Well, we have one comment from the audience, and they said, it's kind of not a question, but it's a comment, said that Black people from Baltimore left Baltimore and started Sandy Grounds in Staten Island. Can you believe that? Staten Island was more welcoming.
Wow.
That to me is just kind of a groundbreaking thing. But yes, this is a huge problem. This was a problem, in Los Angeles, where you had Black mayors, Black police chiefs, but yet you still have this institutional racism, where it's kind of like you can't just change the race of the players of the game. It's a game that is corrupt. I want to go, we are kind of in New Jersey. We are talking about giving developers tax breaks to kind of like, well, we need to get this development. How can we, how can we need to help? We need to like, invigorate the community. We need to give these developers like money to make that happen, because who else would want to come here? I mean, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I think Amazon is the primary example for both of our states, Maryland and New Jersey, where our governors and the city of Newark, I believe, in our city, Baltimore, we were ready to give away the farm to get this company in our city. They wouldn't have to pay certain taxes. They wouldn't have to become a corporate citizen. They would basically become a corporate freeloader. And so that also exacerbates, basically we would be providing corporate welfare to the already rich, even though we have people in our cities today that are very low income, struggling with deep poverty, and essentially the money in our general fund, again, it goes back to this apartheid budget. We end up saying let's spending more on policing, and then not even taxing the people that have the resources, not even taxing the companies that have millions and billions of dollars in revenues. And so you see this extreme privileging of the corporate elite. And that's really what white supremacy is all about, is keeping the people that have the capital in power and safe from being able to actually contribute in an equitable way.
Yeah, this is, and it's kind of like so many people we want to have jobs. We want to have jobs, but, I've seen over and over again, those jobs that we get, that Black people get, that people in the communities get, they're the jobs that either don't pay anything or they are nice jobs, but we end up getting pushed out the neighborhood. I mean, are you having issues with gentrification in Baltimore?
Well, gentrification today is actually more so happening in our white neighborhoods, neighborhoods like Hamden, Remington. These are communities that are losing their Black population, even though they're majority white communities. But in essence, well, there's one area that is really predominantly, or was predominantly Black, and that's the area near Johns Hopkins University's medical campus in East Baltimore. They displaced 732 Black families in the 2000s under then Mayor Martin O'Malley, who became governor and now is going to be a perennial candidate for president and going to make people think that he was progressive when he is decidedly not. He helped uproot people in East Baltimore, Black people, lower income people, for the benefit of this corporate entity, Johns Hopkins University. So we are seeing it in that sense. We are seeing the mass displacement of Black people through corporate entities like Johns Hopkins. And I think we're also seeing it in terms of the University of Maryland on the west side of the city. They're building a biopark. Actually, Johns Hopkins is building a biotech park. So you could see like how these quote unquote anchor institutions, they get these sort of tax breaks. They get the ability to help push out people in the community and to build and actually support the enterprise of research and development for pharmaceutical companies. And so there's that corporate collusion once again, and Black people, Black communities are left hung to dry.
No, I mean, and another issue you talked about was health, and how health and urban planning, or poor urban planning, because I mean, I don't know, are they planning these communities like specifically in this way to make us unhealthful, to kill us? I mean, how do we get people to understand the connection between health and urban planning? I think a lot of times in our community, we kind of be like, oh, urban planning, transportation, but actually we don't think that way. But I think that in regards to journalism, in regards to writing, in regards to media, we don't really talk about it. We can't get this kind of stuff funded because it's an invested interest for us to not be educated on this. So how can you go a little bit about health and urban planning, how that's connected?
Sure. I think the bottom line is this: Black neighborhoods don't matter to urban planners, only to the degree that it may function as valuable land where the people can be cleared, and white people, white communities, white corporate entities can take control of that. Other than that, Black neighborhoods don't matter. And I think if Black neighborhoods don't matter, Black lives cannot matter by default. And I think even in our activist spaces, we have to have the understanding that we just can't be energized and mobilized around Black death and Black people being killed by police. We have to be energized in the way that our neighborhoods, and the way that these systems operate in our neighborhood. We have to look at transportation, bike lanes, protected bike lanes, cars and highways and rapid rail. We have to look at all of these modalities and understand that if people don't have affordable, rapid transit, they can't get to work. That's going to boost unemployment. That's going to keep people locked out of opportunity. You have to look at the education system and say, if we're not investing in public education, our children continue to end up with miseducation and undereducation, and they can't reach their full potential. So Black neighborhoods have to become the foundation of our analysis for urban planning. And I think along with that, we have to look at the way that data is interpreted and data is collected. So I like to say that Black data analysis matters, that oftentimes we have data, you have planners, you have statisticians, and they're fond of using statistics in a way that doesn't lift up Black neighborhoods. And so we have to actually have a data analysis framework, and we have to have a way of urban planning that's going to lift up our neighborhoods, which is why I think I look at the movie Black Panther, and I look at the city, the country of Wakanda. I look at the Golden City, and I think about, well, what was the urban planning that went into making Wakanda? How can we make Baltimore Wakanda?
Exactly.
How can we make Wakanda? Like, Black neighborhoods can be beautiful. They don't have to be what white neighborhoods are, but what type of thinking and planning can we put in place in our own systems, in our own communities, that will help us propel us to become the places like Wakanda that we can be?
Yeah, I that movie, to me, Black Panther, was so inspirational for me in regards to, I know there were some issues, but I felt, wow, what we could have. I love the fact that you had a neighborhood in Wakanda. They were walking around, and it didn't look like Paris. It didn't look like, it didn't look like a European city. It looked like an African city, and people were walking, and there weren't, people didn't have to have cars, and they were just, so exactly.
Did you see the maglevs, the mass transit? They had like hover taxis, not pollution. You didn't see pollution in the air and all of that. I mean, so it was green, it was sustainable. It was, the buildings weren't built out of glass and steel. It was more earthy type of material, earthen material, so just the whole notion of what goes into making a city, I thought was, for me, very inspirational to think about how could you build a golden city in a way that's different from what we find in Western societies.
And how, the thing is, to wrap this up, because I very much enjoyed talking to you. Just, this is to me, is an amazing, your work, your scholarship, the information that you give online. And let me put out your Twitter handle. I mean, yes, when your book comes out, we're definitely gonna get your book. We're gonna definitely, but we're also too, we want to read your writing. We want to support you in things like that. I think that's something else, when we have these Black academics that are, that are thinking, that are socially conscious, we have to support you. We have to look at your scholarship. We have to, when we're doing our journalism, our news stories, we have to quote you guys, because you guys are doing the hard work. You're doing the hard work. And so how can people support you? How can we help you?
Well, I mean, actually, we're planning now to engage in hopefully a summer of struggle and protest here in Baltimore. We're going to have what's called Baltimore Freedom Summer. April the 4th is going to be 50 years since the assassination of Dr. King. April the 11th is going to be the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. And after Dr. King's assassination, there was planning and actually some execution for a Poor People's Campaign. So we're 50 years in that cycle of sort of commemorating and celebrating that legacy. And we want to lift that up this summer, starting on April the 4th. And we want to I would love for people to join us and contact us and figure out how we can be involved. You can contact me on Twitter at @BeMoreDoc. But I just want to thank you for your work. I feel like we have to work together, academics, folks in the community, journalists, we're really, we're all trying to figure out how to get away from the devastation of historical trauma so that we can make our neighborhoods like Wakanda.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. And that's it for Black Kids in Outer Space. Thank you, all the people who watched. We appreciate it. And thank you, Dr. Brown. Next week, we're going to have Dr. Gleason. So I am very excited about that. So have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye. Black Kids in Outer Space. Black Kids in Outer Space. Black Kids in Outer Space. Urban planning, walking, bicycling, and more in our space.